Here in my hand, I've got an object that is very important to the history of Knole. This is the handwritten manuscript of Virginia Woolf's novel, Orlando, published in 1928. The book tells the story of Orlando, a nobleman in the reign of Elizabeth I, who lives for 300 years and turns into a woman along the way. The novel is playful, irreverent, and very queer. Virginia Woolf took aim at the seriousness of the disciplines of history and biography, mixing fact and fiction, and bending time and gender. In doing so, she weaved Orlando into the history of Knole forever. But in order to understand how the manuscript ended up at Knole, we need to turn to one of Knole's most famous inhabitants, Vita Sackville-West. Knole was the ancestral home of Vita. She was a novelist, poet, and gardener, as well as the inspiration for Orlando. Vita and Virginia were friends and lovers, and Orlando is testament to their relationship. In the now oft-quoted quote, Vita's son Nigel called the novel the longest and most charming love letter in literature. As a token of her love, Virginia gifted the manuscript to Vita, and the inscription reads, "Vita from Virginia, December the 6th, 1928. Virginia wrote the manuscript in her distinctive purple ink, a colour she reserved for her manuscripts, love letters, and diaries. Virginia was enamoured by what she saw as the romance of Vita's aristocratic family history, which spanned centuries and lined Knole's wood-panelled walls with family portraits. Vita had written her own family history, titled Knole and the Sackvilles, which Virginia liberally lifted parts from and transplanted into her own novel. What Virginia did in Orlando was take all of this history and condense it into one person, Orlando. After all, this is how Virginia saw Vita, writing, "All those ancestors and centuries and silver and gold have bred a perfect body." Now, Orlando is full of in-jokes and gossipy references to Vita's sometimes sensational life and family history, but it is as much about Knole as it is about Vita. In many ways, Orlando was a collaboration between Virginia, Vita, and Knole itself. Virginia went down to Knole especially to pick which of the many portraits she wanted to illustrate the novel's cast of colourful characters, and Vita was photographed for the novel herself, posing as Orlando. Violet Trefusis, Vita's childhood friend and later lover, once wrote that Vita belonged to Knole, to the courtyards, gables, galleries, to the prancing sculptured leopards, to the traditions, rites, and splendours. Vita may have belonged to Knole, but Knole did not belong to Vita. Under the rules of male primogeniture, the rules around inheritance in England in the early 1900s, Vita was prevented from inheriting Knole because she was born a girl. The loss of Knole is something she would mourn her entire life. Vita once said she would have given up her soul for Knole, and as late as the 1950s, she was lamenting having been born a daughter instead of a son. Virginia saw just how much Vita's disinheritance hurt her and sought to put it right in the world of fiction through creative license. In Orlando, Vita as Orlando gets to inherit the ancestral home. For Vita, this was the birthright she felt she was denied. Vita once said, "Knole is mine and I am Knole's, and that is that. I know every bit of stone in it and I love it, and I think and hope and believe that it loves me as I love it," a sort of mystical feeling. When Orlando was published, Vita's husband Harold wrote to her to say the novel will cement the bond between Knole and Vita and will perpetuate this identity into years when both you and I are dead. When Vita first read the novel, she wrote to Virginia to say that her descriptions of Knole had made her cry. She also wrote that she had a strange feeling that Knole knows about Orlando and is pleased. The manuscript became one of her most treasured possessions. When Vita died, her family bequeathed the manuscript of Orlando to Knole. If Vita is Orlando and Orlando is Vita, then it feels very symbolic that the manuscript is now in Knole's permanent collection. Finally, Vita as Orlando had come home.